Okay, guys, welcome to your lecture, or what is this, our third lecture in our ecology unit. This is on the community level of ecological organization, and it's about what we call community relationships. So just to refresh your memory, so far we have discussed the populations level. Well, first of all, we started by discussing all the levels of ecological organization. And then just last week, we were talking about the population level and learning a few things about the dynamics of a population, what causes population growth rate to change, and things like that. This week, we're focusing on kind of the next level up, or the next largest level, and that is the level of the community. So your textbook actually kind of begins this portion by discussing two very important vocabulary terms, and those two terms are the differences between biotic and abiotic factors. So there's actually just kind of this paragraph right here that you can read for yourself, and it does a fine job of explaining the difference between those two things. But just kind of to summarize real quickly for you here, this is going to be tough to enunciate. Biotic factors are living factors or biological factors that influence an ecosystem. So bio means life, so a biotic factor is a living factor in an ecosystem. Compare that to an abiotic factor. Abiotic factors are non-living components of ecosystems. Now, what I have to set straight for you here is that we are not talking yet about the level of an ecosystem. So remember that in an ecosystem, not only do we have biotic factors and living components, but at the ecosystem level we have abiotic factors or non-living components. Since this week we are just talking about communities, we have not yet introduced the abiotic components of these ecosystems. We're not talking about the ecosystem level yet. So an appropriate example of something we might be talking about this week are, for example, these two biotic things, these two living organisms and how they relate to each other, like this bobcat and this rabbit, or how this biotic grass, this living grass, and this rabbit relate to one another. That could be something we're talking about this week. So even though your textbook starts to talk about abiotic, non-living versus biotic, living, this week is our final week of just focusing on the biotic factors, the living factors, and how they kind of interact with one another to make communities. So a very common thing that we talk about when we're discussing the community level of organization and these strictly biotic factors are different ways that different species, can interact with one another. Because remember, at the level of a population, you're dealing with organisms that all belong to the same species that occupy the same area. Now that we've stepped up a level of ecological organization to the community level, we're talking about multiple species still living, but multiple living species interacting with one another. So now we're starting to get a little bit more complex interactions. So there's 4 interactions that are pictured here on this page, and I just want to spend a little time and talk about each one of them and how they are significant to this study of communities, the community level of organization. So let's start right here with this first kind of picture. And we have a grizzly bear standing in a nice kind of roaring river, about to catch a fish in its mouth. So this is an example of two communities, right? Two different species. So I shouldn't say two communities, two species. So we have the bear and we have the fish. So you could have a greater population of bears and population of fish, but those two populations interacting make a community. They're both biotic factors. They're both living things. Okay, but this particular picture here is an example of a relationship at the community level known as predation. And you all probably know what predation means, but predation is simply when one organism, in this case the bear, captures, kills, and eats another organism, in this case the fish. So predation is an example of a community interaction. It's one species, a bear in this case, capturing, killing, and eating another species, in this case the fish. So you do need to know a little bit about predation. Okay. The reason that I've highlighted this kind of off by itself is because these 3 other pictures that I'm about to talk about kind of are off in their own group. Okay. These 3 pictures here talk about what we call symbiotic relationships or symbiosis. Okay? So symbiosis is defined as two organisms of different species interacting closely with each other. And this is a very important distinction. Right here, predation, what we just talked about, is not considered a form of symbiosis. Predation is not considered a form of symbiosis because it doesn't depict two organisms living and interacting closely together, because the sole purpose of one organism, again the bear, is to kill another organism, in this case the fish. So it's kind of a technicality, but we're not talking about two different species living and interacting with another in predation, but we are talking about two species interacting and living with one another in these other three examples. So symbiosis, we're talking about different species living and interacting closely together. In predation, we're not talking about the same thing. So predation is not an example of symbiosis. It is, however, an example of community interactions. Okay. Our first example of symbiosis comes right here from, let's see, we'll make this, I guess, number 2, because it is our second community interaction, but it's really our first example of symbiosis. And this is a picture of a relationship that we call mutualism. And it's based on that root word right at the beginning, mutual. So in mutualism, we have two organisms from different species, so we do have a community. But those species are mutually benefiting each other. In other words, both species are benefiting from the interaction. Okay? This particular example here of a hummingbird and a flower shows two species benefiting because the hummingbird can stick its long beak kind of down deep there in the flower and obtain nutrients. It's the source of sugar, that nectar that keeps the hummingbird able to flap its wings as quickly as it flaps and allows the hummingbird to reproduce and carry on all of its life-giving processes. So the bird in this case, and I'll do a plus sign here, is positively affected or benefits from this relationship because it obtains nutrients. Now the flower also benefits from this relationship because as the hummingbird sticks its beak down into that deeper part of the flower down there, the flower is able to give some pollen, some reproductive material off onto the hummingbird. And when the hummingbird goes and lands somewhere else on another flower of the same species, basically the hummingbird is allowing that flower to reproduce with a flower of its same species somewhere else. So the hummingbird benefits from this relationship by obtaining nutrients, and the flower benefits from this relationship by being able to reproduce. So it's a mutually beneficial relationship. Therefore, it's called mutualism. Okay, let's go down here to the third example of community interactions, but really our second example of symbiosis or symbiotic relationships. This is kind of an interesting example of something we call commensalism. Commensalism. Okay, so commensalism is where one of the two species, remember we have to have different species because we're talking about a community, but one of the species benefits where the other species is really unaffected. They don't, the second species really doesn't care, is not really affected by the outcome of the relationship. Okay? In this case, one of the two species is actually not pictured, but it's the species that left all of this garbage behind, and that is good old human beings, Homo sapiens. Okay? So we have one species not pictured here, but they're the ones responsible for leaving the garbage. We have another species pictured here, and that is the baboon in this case. So we have this kind of troop of baboons. Now, the baboons are actually benefiting from this relationship because they are rooting through this garbage and eating it, and again, obtaining nutrients, okay, getting energy. So that's good for the baboons. The humans that left all this garbage behind, let's just, how about we'll use a question mark to represent their side of the story. Okay, they really don't benefit. They're not benefited. They're not harmed by this relationship. They don't really care. Someone threw all this garbage out in a trash can and never thought about it again. Whereas to the baboons, it was an important source of food and an important source of nutrients. So the baboons were positively affected by the relationship. Humans were kind of unaffected by this relationship, and that is an example of commensalism. And then over here in our fourth and final example of community relationships, but really our third example of symbiosis, this is a common relationship that undoubtedly you've heard of, but probably in a different form. This is known as parasitism. Okay? This is known as parasitism. In parasitism, one of the two species involved is positively affected, benefits, whereas the other species involved is actually negatively affected or is harmed in some way by the relationship. Okay, that's, you probably know various forms of parasites, but when we think parasites, we tend to think these creepy, crawly little bugs or things that might get under our skin, or we kind of have this different perception of parasites. Here's an example of a parasitic relationship you might not know about. In this case, this bird right here is a cuckoo bird, and it is actually positively affected by this relationship. Okay. These two birds that are feeding it are going to be negatively affected by this relationship. So we have a positive effect and a negative effect. The cuckoo bird is positively affected because its parent came and laid eggs into another bird's nest. So this is kind of an invader. Okay. The reason this is good for this invasion, this cuckoo bird that invaded the nest, is because it is now being fed food from another bird. It actually destroys all of the eggs that were previously in this nest and takes that nest over. So it's now receiving nutrients from these two parents. So that's good for this bird. Okay. However, it's bad for this species, it's bad for the parents and their species, because they're taking all their hard work and all their nutrients and they're funneling it into a child that's not even theirs and doesn't even belong to their species. So their species is losing out because it's giving its resources to another species. That's bad for these two parents, but it's actually great for the cuckoo bird. So there's parasitism, an example of one species being positively affected while the other one is harmed or negatively affected. Okay, quickly here we're going to talk about two different forms of what are known as ecological succession. So succession takes place, or ecological succession is basically a gradual change to a community following some sort of disturbance. So we have a community that's been disturbed, and the change that follows is known as succession. And this picture right here demonstrates one type of succession known as primary succession. So primary succession takes place when the disturbance that occurred through a community completely wipes out the entire community, including the soil. So primary succession takes place when change occurs and there is no soil present for that change from the get-go. This picture right here, picture A, represents kind of this barren landscape where there's not even any soil for new life to grow in. Okay? However, in picture B, we now get the presence of something that is called a pioneer species, and lichens are an example of a pioneer species. The very first species to come colonize this kind of barren, destroyed area and create the basis for new life is known as a pioneer species. And once a pioneer species is established, then more species can start to infiltrate that recently disturbed community. And then even more species, like these tall trees and these grasses that fill the hill. So this is an example of something known as primary succession, where a disturbance has kind of wiped out a community and there was no soil to begin with. And then we have this pioneer species come and be the first life form to kind of reestablish life in that area. And the final form of succession that we're going to talk about in this lesson is known as secondary succession. So it's still a disturbance kind of tearing its way through a community. In this case, as shown in picture A, the disturbance has not completely decimated the soil. Okay, so some sort of disturbance comes through and completely wipes out the soil in primary succession. And by the way, an example, I should have said this before, but an example of primary succession or an event that would cause primary succession would be something like say, a volcanic eruption where magma spews down a hillside and completely wipes out all the soil. Okay. In this case, maybe we had a wildfire some years ago, and here's my really cool picture of fire. Maybe we had wildfire come through some years ago. Okay. Now, in this case, secondary succession, that wildfire destroyed lots of the community, but it left the soil intact. Okay. So secondary succession, we get new species a lot quicker because the soil is still there from the get-go. And eventually, we arrive at, over here, picture D, something we call a climax community, which is essentially a very well-established, very stable, unchanging community that was based on this idea that there was a disturbance, but the soil stayed intact.